You know, it's funny. The series has been around for 25 years, and yet no other large game company has decided to do something similar. Granted, there was PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, but that game never honestly had a shot of competing with Nintendo, and Microsoft played it safe and never attempted to make a crossover fighting game. Now, I know what a lot of you are going to say, what about Sega? You know, when they still made consoles. Well, funny you should ask.
Yeah, Sega made their own crossover fighting game. However, there should be an asterisk I should add with this. This game was produced and released 2 years before the original Super Smash Bros. On the N64, thus becoming one of the first major game company crossover fighting games to ever be produced. Funny, huh? Well, here's how that one happened. Our story begins in 1994 with the Saturn release of Virtua Fighter. The port of the 1993 arcade fighter was a huge success, especially being one of the launch titles for the Saturn's US release in 1995. The team behind the arcade Saturn port, Sega's AM2, was asked by the main company to complete 3 other fighting games for the arcade and possible future Saturn releases. These would be the already in production Virtua Fighter 2, along with Fighting Vipers and Sonic the Fighters, being released between 1994 to 1996, with Sonic the Fighters being the only one out of the 3 to unfortunately not receive a Sega Saturn port. These 3 games would go on to be successful as well, with Virtua Fighter 2 becoming the best-selling arcade fighting game of 1995, with the Saturn port receiving 1.5 million pre-orders for its December 1995 release in Japan. Meanwhile, Fighting Vipers and Sonic the Fighters would become cult classics, with the former receiving a sequel for the Dreamcast based on the success of the Saturn port sales in Japan. Unfortunately, the sequel would only be released in Japan and Europe, as the United States gave the game more of a critical appreciation than in sales numbers. With that said, these games being produced by Sega AM2 were large enough successes that the idea of making a crossover between Virtua Fighters and Fighting Vipers was starting to float around in the summer of '96, right around the time Sonic the Fighters production was coming to a wrap and preparing for release. But what would start as just a simple crossover fighting game between 2 series would become something more. In an interview Sega AM2 gave a month before its release, the crew stated that as they were developing the game, the team decided to add more characters from the other arcade and Saturn games they had been developing during the period between 93 and 96, thus making the game more of a celebration of the Saturn era than an average crossover fighting game. The crew essentially wanted to make a game for the Sega Saturn supporters and die-hard fans. The game's production was kept a secret from the public until they decided to have a press interview a month before the game was set to release on November 6, 1996. It was here that the crew expressed their concept for the game that I had previously stated a little bit back. The team would also state in that press conference that the game was easy to create, with the only issue the team had being the task of getting all the fighting moves from Virtua Fighter 2 compressed into a single disc. This was accomplished through the means of new technology that was created to help in the composition technique. The roster for the game was chosen out of the simplicity the crew would have in implementing them into the game, as well as the crew wanting to add in some fan-favorite characters from their and Sega's older titles. This roster would include obviously the characters from Virtua Fighter 2, Akira Yuki, Pai-chan, Lao-chan, Wolf Hawkfield, Jeffrey McWild, Cage Maru, Sarah Bryant, Jack Bryant, Shun-Di, Lion Raphael, and Dural. While on the Fighting Viper side, there was Grace, Spawn, Raxel, Tokyo, Sanmon, Jane, and Honey, also known as Candy internationally. No, this isn't the time nor the place for that future video. Picky, Mauler, BM, and Kuma-chan and Panda-chan. Now, along with these 2 fighting game rosters, there were additional characters brought in from other Sega games produced by Sega AM2. These would be Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite from Sonic the Fighters, Janet Marshall from Virtual Cop 2, Kid Akira and Sarah from Virtual Fighter Kids, the car Hornet from Daytona USA, Taro Yamada from the Sega Genesis game Rent a Hero, Seba, a cut character from Virtua Fighter, and Uraban, a more powerful version of the Fighting Vipers character of the same name. Along with that roster, the team would go on to create some new characters for the game like Deku, a comical Mexican green bean and a hat.
Say goodbye to Sega's cultural sensitivity.
The palm tree logo for Sega AM2.
What an odd choice to make.
And finally, Mr. Meat, or Niku, a sentient piece of meat.
Take it someone on the team was hungry.
While these additional characters were unlockable through the usual means of playing through certain sections of the game, other characters like the palm tree logo, Mr. Meat, were only unlockable through insane means like playing the game for 84 hours or booting up the game 30 times. When the game was released on December 21st, 1996, it became one of the Saturn's best-selling games, with Japan alone selling 600,000 copies. The game would receive a US and European release the following year, with the US receiving the game on April 30th, 1997, and Europe getting the game later that summer in June. The game would also receive critical praise from gaming outlets like Game Informer and Electronic Gaming Monthly, who gave the game an overrating of 88, with some criticism being made on the graphics not having as many polygons or a lower resolution in comparison to Virtua Fighter 2, and the opponent's AI being incredibly easy. These were considered minor as the overall presentation and roster made up for those shortcomings. Interestingly, this was the only Sega AM2 game to never receive an arcade release.
My feelings overall on the game are mostly positive. I can say this was a fun fighting game with an interesting roster. Sure, it's nothing to write home about, but if you were to compare this to the selection of any other fighting games roster during that time, like Street Fighter EX or Mortal Kombat Trilogy, this offered something different and something unique. The idea of merging two different gaming styles is something we wouldn't see again until Capcom vs. SNK in 1999. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about how Sega may have beaten Nintendo to the punch on the idea of a company crossover game. Note I said may have.
Alright, before I even dive into the subject, let me acknowledge a few things. I know that Capcom has made crossover fighting games as well during this time with Marvel, but it should be known that the first two games in the Marvel vs. Capcom series were only centered on Marvel vs. the Street Fighter roster, as opposed to the entire Capcom library of characters. That wouldn't happen until 1998 with Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of the Superheroes. It should also be known that many may point out to Guy from the Final Fight series being in Street Fighter starting with Street Fighter Alpha 3, but that wasn't until 1998, and even then it was later confirmed by Capcom that Street Fighter and Final Fight were set in the same universe, so that's not going to count as well. This also goes for anyone who wants to point this out with SNK's fighting games. Sorry, they're all still set in the same universe. Plus, Capcom wouldn't make their own crossover fighting game until 2004 with Capcom Fighting Jam or Capcom Fighting Evolution to us Americans. Konami also had crossover games back in the 90s, only in Japan though, but those were also platformers, not fighters. Finally, back to those fighting games from SNK and Capcom, they didn't off variations in fighting style until SNK vs. Capcom Millennium Match 2000 and, well, 2000. Now that we got through all of that, let's talk about Super Smash Bros. For the N64. It can't be denied that when comparing Fighters Megamix to Super Smash Bros., the latter went on to become a more influential presence in the gaming community, while the former became more of a cult classic. But I will make a case that Fighters Megamix had to have some influence on the Nintendo IP crossover, right? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, it should be noted as an influence just for the fact that Sega proved it could be done, crossing over various characters from various games. Albeit a small selection, but we'll talk about that in a minute. They proved that that could theoretically work. However, Super Smash Bros. Was able to take what Sega started with Fighters Megamix and add an influence of the Outfoxies, a 2D platforming fighting game created by Namco in 1995, to make a better presentation out of what crossover fighting games should be like.
So, why does Super Smash Bros. Get more recognition for the company-wide crossover fighting game genre than Sega should have with Fighters? Well, I think it comes down to recognizable characters, which Nintendo did a better job at acknowledging than Sega did.
Yeah, while I'll praise the roster for having an interesting mix of characters from all sides of Sega AM2's team, it does feel like the roster felt a little empty by not including more Sega characters. Now, I understand the main reason this wasn't done was because the game was produced within a year and the team was already working hard, on trying to get the two separate fighting styles implemented in already. But I want you to ponder on this idea just for a second. What if instead of Bark the Polar Bear and Bean the Dynamite, we would have gotten Sonic and Tails from Sonic the Fighters? That could have been feasible, but AM2 didn't work or, well, create the Sonic the Hedgehog series. Sonic Team did. They would have had to ask Sonic Team for permission to use the characters. Now I may be theorizing here, but there could also be a possible second reason for why the roster became what it became. Sega didn't know the game was in development at AM2. All they knew was that the team was working on a new fighting game for the Saturn, so Sega never considered what was actually being done until the game had its press release. All Sega was left to do was to release it and market it. Sega advertised that this game was the first true 3D fighting game of its kind, but it does make you wonder if Sega had ever realized they may have squandered on their opportunity to experiment with the ideas of crossover fighting games, especially after Super Smash Bros. Was released 2 years later. Maybe had Sega been told what Sega AM2 was working on, the company could have stepped in a bit more and offered additional help with fitting the fighting moves on the disc, as well as maybe offering AM2 a chance to utilize characters outside their department. Imagine a true Sega crossover fighting game in 1996, multiple Sega characters spreading across the company's history from the video game market. Characters from Sonic the Hedgehog, Puyo Puyo, Virtua Fighters, Fighting Vipers, Daytona USA, Super Hang-On, Streets of Rage, Alex Kidd, Alien Syndrome, Golden Axe, Shinobi, Virtua Cop, Rent-A-Hero, Phantasy Star, amongst many others. But alas, we'll never get to know. Now I love this game, and it may not be my #1 favorite fighting game of all time, but it's still up there, and despite the feelings I have deep down inside from time to time over what could have been had the development of the game gone a little differently, it makes me honestly want to sit here and consider this Sega Super Smash Bros. Before there was Super Smash Bros.
心細いね